Welcome to Age, Pension, Super and Retirement. I'm your host Yvonne, and as always, this podcast is information only and not personal advice. Today, we will be looking at, is your marriage strong enough to survive retirement? And to do so, I would like to welcome back the Director of Prosperity Planning Partners, Gayle McHugh.
Thanks for having me.
Gayle, do you see couples with different or conflicting retirement goals?
Oh, almost every week. And when I say that, there's always one with relatively inachievable, grandiose ideas about how they will spend retirement. And they're usually the person who has never managed the money. And then there's the other one going, hang on, we've got to be a little bit more even-minded in how we do this. We can't spend everything now because we won't have anything for later when we may need it to support ourselves or help our kids.
That makes such sense that one wouldn't really have a grasp on how much to spend and how long it would last if they did certain things.
Exactly. I've got one lot of clients at the moment. He retired with a goal that he was going to go and do a specific holiday, and he has worn his wife down after 18 months of being retired. She knows I can't really afford to do this trip, but she's agreed to do it in 18 months' time. And she's like, I said, but you've told me you don't want to do it. She said, yes, but this is for peace, Gayle.
So tricky aligning, isn't it, by the sound of things?
Because these two have never really talked about money the way, or life goals, the way you would expect a really connected couple to. They live in the same house, have similar, well, they've got the same children, but they have not really had that close relationship you would get where you actually talk about things. They do things together, but they don't necessarily talk about things.
Yeah, that's such an interesting insight. And Gayle, how important is it to have independent activities and interests in retirement?
I personally haven't got to retirement age, but I'm looking at this from my client's perspective and my parents' perspective when they were alive. It's really important to have your own thoughts and independent activities and interests, because if you don't, what happens when you're just the only one left? That's one aspect of it. But the other one is, by having those independent activities and interests, you actually have a wider cohort of community that can help support you emotionally. And it's great from the perspective of having a potential new view on how life works.
I love that, having another potential new view. On the other hand, would you think that too much togetherness, I guess joined at the hip, could be toxic in retirement?
Oh, yes. I'm laughing because I'm thinking of two different couples. I have an aunt and uncle who spend a lot of time together, but because they have their own interests, they're great together. They've been retired for 20 plus years and they're still doing things together, but individually. And for those that are just too together because they haven't got those external interests and they haven't got those other communities that they can be in, it can get really toxic, particularly when it comes to the blame game, which I'll bring up later on. But the blame game is something that happens in a lot of relationships when there's no real communication.
That does sound toxic, Gayle. And when you consider that most working couples only spend 35 to 40 hours a week together, do you think many relationships can survive 80 plus hours a week together?
Well, not unless there's those separate interests and that willingness to grow together. I know separate interests and willingness to grow together sound contradictory, but they can be complementary at the same time. And when I read this question, I was like, oh, I wonder what the stats on divorce rates are in people who are over 65. The overall divorce rate is 30 to 32% in people over 50, but in those over 65, it's 8 to 12%. So you're looking at 1 in 10 people that you know who are over 65 could end up divorcing after typical retirement age. And the most interesting part about that for me was that apparently divorce rates in the 65 plus are growing steadily especially in long-term relationships, 25 to 40 years. And while I'm not 65, my marriage fell apart after 34 years.
That's such a interesting and scary statistic. I guess the difficulty would be that much greater when someone's, say, over 65 and suddenly on their own.
Oh, it can be absolutely devastating, particularly, well, in fact, there's a widely known term for it. It's called grey divorce. So that people who are 65 plus are divorcing. And, it wasn't heard of when my parents were alive. My grandparents just wasn't done. Now it's like, well, I've still got a life to live. And people are divorcing at 65, it's less about instability of a relationship. It's like, I can do this on my own. I've been basically doing it on my own anyway. But some of the problems that come with that, it impacts superannuation splitting, housing security, and even longevity risk as a single household is reduced in comparison to people being in a relationship, because it is communication. Even though it may not be good communication, there's still some support there.
That's huge, Gayle. What sort of planning or personal agreements could be put into place?
I got a little bit of help from my friend co-pilot on this one, because I was like, ooh, this is a bit deep. And I had already identified some of them. Like, planning your retirement together is not just about the money. It's about having scheduled date nights. They don't have to be expensive. You could go for a walk on the beach. You could have a picnic in the park. You don't have to blow the budget. Having those regular shared activities, but most importantly, for the empty nesters and those approaching retirement, having shared goals. And I'm not just talking about what are we doing next week. It's the longer term plans that you need to have shared goals for. Other things that came up were having strong communication and making sure that you talk regularly and honestly about the state of play in your relationship. I identified, for example, in my relationship that we weren't talking, we were just cohabiting. And I said to my now ex-husband, can we please go and see a counsellor and get some assistance in helping us to communicate? And his attitude was, there's nothing to talk about. A few years later, here we are in divorce land, because for him, it was uncomfortable. And I know talking about things that annoy us can be uncomfortable, but if we can't talk to each other, how are we going to resolve these things? And another thing that I loved was to own your feelings. I feel, instead of going, you always make me feel, or you always whatever. Own it and go, I feel really whatever. Just own it, because then you're not blaming the other person for the way you're feeling. You're owning your stuff. And another most really interesting one was to avoid the silent treatment, because you cannot communicate with a brick wall.
Thanks so much, Gayle, for sharing that personal story. Would you say that some people have nothing in common other than their address? In fact, I know this is actually a Gaylism, but can you tell any stories about these extreme cases?
Yes. The reality of it is there's a lot of people that only have their children and their residential address in common. They don't have any shared interests or activities. And often that starts with just, you're going to laugh, but simple warning signs where people do this little emotional withdrawal. It might sound little, but when I say little, it's things like going, oh, what's for dinner? They're not having those deeper and meaningful conversations. And interestingly, another thing that my little mate co-pilot identified was that lack of conflict does not mean you have a strong, stable relationship. It means that there's unresolved conflicts sitting under there and boiling away and creating havoc.
So what you're saying, some conversations might be difficult, they might be uncomfortable, but they're really important.
Absolutely. And if you are trying to start those conversations, bear in mind that you can't be responsible for the way the other person responds or reacts. If they're not willing to engage, well, you can't go past that. So don't blame yourself for them not engaging. You've got to be realistic and go, takes two people to be in a relationship. Now, another sign is that people who live in the same house are no longer interested in the other person. They don't ask about their thoughts, their feelings, or their goals. They feel like, oh, I've lived with this person for the last 25 bloody years. I already know them. I don't need to know anything more. And you get to the point where you treat each other as housemates. There's no hugs, there's no affection. I'm not talking about sex. I'm just talking about just a smile, a nice little hug, a soft question going, are you okay today?
Some warmth and checking in.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you touched on this earlier, Gayle, about the importance of having an independent social network. Could you speak on that a little more?
I feel that it's particularly important because I've been helping people since 1980, so quite a while, around banking and financial planning. So every time there's a loss of a partner or a loss of a family member, like a mother, a parent, we've got these issues where all of a sudden people lose their way without support. If they are living on their own, having social networks is incredibly important because they're the people who are going to maybe pick up the phone or text you and go, hey, are you okay? Haven't seen you for a while. Need to just know that you're okay. Without having that sort of interest from an outside party, people tend to feel very isolated, and they can get to the point where they feel either unloved or, what's the point in being here? So, yeah, it's really important to have those external interests and cohort that you can actually do things with.
Gayle, how can you be reached?
I can be reached on 0407 159 298 or by email at Gayle, Gayle, at prosperityplanning.com.au.
Gayle, when we were preparing for this episode, we talked about some people just planning for the big holiday, and the real question is, and then what?
Now that is the key factor, because without having some communication and shared goals, you're not going to know what the other person wants to do. I've got some clients who haven't even made it to retirement. Well, I've had, I should say, clients who haven't even made it to retirement age because of health issues. One man died at 52. So right now, he hasn't had a chance to appreciate retirement. So my question to you is to be curious about what you can do together, what will basically give you a fulfilling life, but to make sure that if you're having agreements about money, take into consideration now, particularly in the days of blended families and people repartnering later in life, are there any estate planning considerations or philanthropic considerations that need to be taken into consideration as part of your long-term plan? Because there's often a mismatch of wealth in a relationship. So think about what you might do to your kids if you repartner without having done some pre-planning. I know that's not part of today's discussion, but it's an important factor. Because realistically, we don't know what's going to happen next.
And there's certainly, as you say, a growing cohort, sadly, with the grey divorce. Gayle, do you come by couples where you mentioned earlier one takes care of all the finances and you need to encourage the education of the other partner?
It's very common. In fact, I've got two clients right now I can think of. One the wife had been secretly buying shares and stashing them, and the husband was like, I only want safe investments. She never told the husband about the share portfolio that she was sitting on their joint behalf. She just made sure he never saw any of the paperwork. It has made them quite a bit of money. That's beside the point. But there was that mismatch. He expected incredible outcomes from investments initially and then realised, oh, actually, maybe this won't work because I have unrealistic expectations. And then, as I said earlier about my person who has retired and has a goal to do a particular trip, and he's like, yep, well, I just want to spend the money. He just doesn't get it because he's never had to manage the money.
So in conventional financial planning, we hear you talk about risk profiles. What happens when a couple's risk profile is different, one partner to the other?
It happens more times than you would ever think. The very first time I came across it was probably within 6 months of me starting to be an advisor. So that was like 28 years ago. And the husband was growth focused and the wife was like, no, I want security. And the interesting part around that conversation was that by time we had unpacked each person's beliefs, they actually were closer in alignment than they thought, because what the wife thought was conservative was actually a share portfolio, because she'd grown up with her parents having shares. And the husband was like, oh, hang on, but I didn't know that. So it was a really interesting conversation when you've got two completely different understandings of what's a risky type of investment.
And it really sounds like your soft skills and experience, Gayle, draw out these important conversations.
In a lot of instances, it's just sort of asking people to tell me more, or I'm curious, what does that mean to you? It's those types of questions that are open-ended and let people speak. And even last week when I was talking to a lovely lady, she said, I'm very conservative. And as we went through our risk profile, she went, oh, maybe I'm not the conservative person that I thought. And instead of being a conservative term deposit loving investor, she was a balanced investor when we unpacked her true thoughts about investing.
Such an interesting topic, Gayle, and you've covered so many different areas. Now, for our international listeners wishing to join our Facebook group, the code word is yellow. Remember that this has been information only and not personal advice. Gayle, thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. I look forward to our next chat.